Kure, 8 August 1940. Before dawn, the tarps sweated river mist, and the covered slipway smelled of wet hemp, hot flux, and tidal mud. Aya kept her head low under a foreman's barked shizuka, quiet as the nameless giant began to move. No band, no christening bottle, only the slow thunder of wooden wedges knocked free and the furtive slap of water along steel that seemed to go on forever. They did not say Yamato aloud. Codes stood in for names. A nation wrapped its wager in blackout cloth. Through a pinhole of light in the tar, Aya glimpsed armour measured not in plates, but in small walls, belt thickness that could stop anything human eyes had yet seen, and imagined the weight bearing down on the river as the hull slid true. The rumours had been poetry and mathematics. 9 guns of 46 centimetres, Type 94s, able to throw a shell the weight of a small car across 40 kilometres, a barrage that would arrive before the sound of its leaving. Turret faces as deep as a doorway, a citadel of steel so dense it seemed immune to time. The men around her said little, but in their silence lay a creed. The big gun returns the world to order. Aya, who had learned to cut and weld because the arsenal needed hands more than applause, held her torch like a candle in a cathedral she would never enter. What she could touch was the seam, the bead, the places where steel met steel and became one thing. She marked numbers in chalk that would disappear in paint and felt the river's cool air on her neck as the hull broke free and took the water with the humility of a mountain kneeling. It was a careful triumph, the kind that asked no witnesses. Even the gulls kept their distance, veering from the tarped shape as if from weather. Somewhere upriver, a drum thudded once, a muffled concession to pride. They would say later that secrecy kept spies blind, that covered docks beat cameras, that shadows were armour. Aya only knew the pause when the hull settled and the river's wake ran out to nothing. The foreman's whistle cut the moment clean, and torches hissed back to life along scaffolds where other secrets gestated in steel. She imagined the ship at sea, her great guns silent until the day they would speak and the world would bow. She could not imagine the sky answering louder. The tarps fluttered, the river's skin smoothed, and the secret moved downstream, nameless and immense, as if the water itself had learned to keep quiet. Pearl Harbor to Fremantle, mid-1944. Chalk dust floated in the fluorescent hum like diesel exhaust does in a warm engine room. The torpedo data computer thrummed under Commander Joe Enright's palm, its brass dials and gears alive with patient arithmetic. "Don't chase the fish," he told the class, voice mild. "Make the target chase your solution." A coffee mug left a ring on the green baize, while red grease pencil arcs braided course, speed and angle on the board. On boats like Archerfish, Ballau class, SS 311, SJ radar painted the night in numbers. Training made those numbers obedient. Momem to C. Red Callahan, sleeves shoved past his elbows, gave the new men the talk no manual quite captured. "Listen to bearings," he said. "They complain before they fail." He cracked a Hershey bar and passed squares around like communion, then ran a hand along the auxiliary pumps as if feeling for a fever. The language of the boat was ritual. Rig for quiet, trim the bubble, set condition Baker. The captain's world was plots and doctrine. Red's was amperage, oil pressure, and the subtle whine that meant brushes needed seating. Between them lay the American system, checklists that grew out of mistakes, spare parts that arrived before you asked, instructors who had already buried the lessons they taught. Doctrine framed patience. The end around, shadow on the surface, batteries guarded like treasure, radar pings counted in seconds instead of hope, wasn't theatrics. It was craft. The TDC did not promise miracles. It promised that careful men with time and power could turn chaos into a straight line. Enright had let a prize slip once. The shame stung less than the certainty that the book had been right and he had been wrong. He would not be wrong again. Charts unfurled across the table, wind over deck, zigzag intervals, stern angles at short range. Nothing romantic, everything decisive. In the evenings, when the Australian sun turned the pier planks to burnt sugar, Red leaned against the fair water and counted the ordinary mercies. Hot coffee that didn't run out, fans that pushed stale air out of corners, a laundry schedule that kept mould from learning your name. They were small civilian luxuries scaled into weapons by consistency. The Japanese were brave, everyone knew that. But bravery didn't grease bearings at 0300 or standardize 1,000 TDCs so that any kid from Iowa could make identical math in identical light. When the call came to cast off again, Enright's voice was easy in the control room. "We'll do it by the book," he said, not for comfort but as a verdict. The men responded like a chord, "Aye, aye," and the boat breathed in as the ballast tanks gave up air. In training, chalk dust had hung like smoke in still air. At sea, it would be diesel, salt, and the faint sweetness of chocolate on a machinist's breath as numbers turned their quiet into fate. Tokyo and Yokosuka, autumn 1944. The blackout curtains made noon a rumour. Aya waited in a ration line that smelled of damp wool and boiled barley, listening to the women ahead of her trade shards of news like contraband. A giant carrier, someone said, bigger than belief, built on the bones of a battleship. Another shook her head. Unfinished, but the war didn't wait. At Yokosuka, Captain Toshio Abe kept his voice measured as orders arrived to sail Shinano by night with a thin screen. Speed was armour now, secrecy was shield, time was enemy. In the dockyards, men dogged hatches that still shone from the shop. Watertight doors were numbered faster than they were tested. Hose teams rehearsed in corridors that would smell of paint for months. The ship could move, therefore it would move. Paper showed pumps that could empty seas. Experience would have preferred a week of drills. Abe walked the frames, hands clasped behind his back, feeling the steady pulse of obligation. He knew what the hull could endure by specification and what his sailors could endure by culture. Between those truths lay a gap no officer can acknowledge aloud. Escorts were promised. A few would come. Fuel was a ledger more than a liquid. The airfields that once promised umbrella now rationed sorties like prayer. Aya's neighbour hissed the obvious sin under her breath. Rich nations can make mistakes. Poor nations cannot. She didn't mean money alone. She meant steel allotments, training cycles, rubber for gaskets, electricians enough to wire a deck twice if the first run proved petty wrong. She meant rice in a machinist's belly and sugar in his tea, so he didn't shake when a wrench demanded finesse. There were numbers the censors couldn't smother. In 1944, the United States would turn out on the order of 96,000 aircraft. Japan would build scarcely a third of that. One American factory line could outpace a cluster of Japanese plants for months at a time, and those planes arrived with fuel, spares, manuals and pilots who had flown the same cockpit for hundreds of hours. It sounded impossible in a queue where barley felt like victory. It sounded like a rumour made of math. At sunset, Shinano's silhouette lifted from scaffolds like a dark horizon inside a brighter one. Steam bled from pipes with the breath of an animal waking. Abe signed the last of a stack of documents and offered a bow that included every man he would not save if the sea decided to test his schedules. In the tenement, Aya snuffed her candle with damp fingers and lay listening for engines, for proof that the nation's secret had learned to walk. The blackout made the night feel loyal. It also made it easy to miss the shape of the storm coming. Off Honshu, 29th November 1944. The periscope lens wore the sea like a cold eyelid. Spray hissed and slid away. Beyond, the night had that brittle transparency sailors trust more than daylight. On the radar repeater, the blip was fat and steady, a mountain that moved. Range constant, bearing drift starboard, the talker murmured, and Enright let the numbers build a face. SJ pulses marked time in green heartbeats. Wind over deck hinted at a flight deck high enough to carve the air. Big, fast, and in a hurry, 3 facts that together were an invitation to craft. The temptation was the oldest mistake. Take a shot because the target exists. Enright could feel that yen in his jaw. He set it aside. "We'll end around," he said, almost conversational, and the boat pivoted on patience. Red slid past with a hand on the manifold as if patting a dog's shoulder. "Batteries are happy," he muttered, eyes on the amp meter. The control room shrank to human scale, dials, voices, pencil on paper, while the ocean swelled to strategic size. The end around is simple in speech and hard in life. Put your boat where the target will be, not where it is. Risk the surface sprint. Keep the wake modest. Let radar whisper instead of shout. They plotted the zigzag. Merchant skippers zig by habit. Warship captains zig by doctrine. If the enemy con believed speed made him untouchable, his zigs would be perfunctory, enough to satisfy order, not enough to break pattern. Enright's grease pencil kissed a future point that did not yet exist, and then drew a straight line into it. The TDC began to hum at a different confidence, its solution less hypothetical, more intimate. Out on the bridge, the night smelled of salt and a faint sweetness from the galley where coffee stayed hot because Americans insisted it should. Below, sounds were a litany, cooling fans, the small click that said a relay kept faith. The sonar man, curt and precise, called bearing rates with the patience of a surgeon. No screws other than target. Escorts? Negative? That would change. Everything changes. But for the moment, the ocean had made a private room for archerfish and a quarry trying to outrun consequence. Enright checked the clock and then his own breathing, adjusting both. "Make turns for 18, he said, and the helmsman replied the way trained men do, once correctly, without embroidery. Patience was not passivity, it was a weapon, and the boat carried plenty. The blip thickened, then smoothed as aspect shifted. Geometry tightened into appetite. Enright looked once through the scope, saw a blacker dark within darkness, higher, squarer, and tasted certainty like iron on his tongue. "We write it down now," he said, and felt the boat lean, not in angle, but in will. Wind took the unfinished flight deck with both hands and shook it. Shinano's bridge lights were hooded, each like a monk's lantern, while the sea tried to read the ship's new handwriting. Captain Toshio Abe kept the con's voice level, cadence a metronome. Zig 30 to starboard. Hold 10. Back to base course. He believed in armour as a sailor believes in the horizon, not as immunity, but as promise. He also believed in schedules. Orders had eroded his caution like waves wear stone. The escort screen was thin, good men in capable hulls, but few, and fuel figured in every verb. Below that composed bridge, damage control would have looked busy and felt green. Dog handles still smelled of the shop. Valve trees were chalked with frame numbers, diagrams half memorized. Hose teams bunched and scattered under petty officers who had drilled more on concrete than at sea. The pumps existed as specifications before they became moods, gallons per minute that meant little until a bulkhead seam asked a question. Abe walked his officers through the deck logs with a schoolmaster's calm, touching a shoulder here, a console there, knitting duty into something like poise. The ship moved at the edge of her own competence. Speed warmed every joint, pressed water at gaskets, turned design margins into a physics lesson no navy likes to take in the field. Aviation fuel lines ran where engineers said they must. Some had been tested, others would have been scheduled for a second pass if time had been a collaborator instead of a thief. In the mess, sailors ate fast and without laughter. They were not afraid. They were new, and new men in a new ship mistake quiet for safety until the sea explains the difference. A sonar report reached the bridge like rumour with rank attached. Probable contact lost, likely non-threat, an escort signalled, and the watch officers exhaled a centimetre. Abe did not. He held to 10-minute zigs because they were written, not because he loved them. He tasked a junior to re-inspect closure discipline along a vulnerable run. The junior saluted and ran. Outside, the night's surface looked like iron hammered thin. Inside, paint clung to bulkheads with that fresh chemical brightness that means nothing has yet touched it hard. In the chart room, a boatswain wiped a drip from a gasket with the back of a hand and told the rivets to keep faith. It was the kind of half-prayer sailors in every language whisper to material before the test. Above, Abe smelled the cold in the air and knew morning would come too early for men who had not slept in their ship. He lifted his binoculars anyway, because habit is another armour, and watched the dark for the shape that would not announce itself. In Archerfish, the torpedo data computer's low hum had the intimacy of a heartbeat. Solutions settled, adjusted, and settled again, as if the machine breathed with its crew. "Standby tubes 1 through 6, Enright said, voice flat as a level. The helmsman eased them along the line the captain had drawn in air an hour ago. End around complete, angle on the bow, now a gift. A pencil ticked the seconds between target zigs. The night thinned toward a sourceless grey. Steam rose from mugs. Red felt the decks whisper through his boots and knew the boat was as ready as human hands make steel. On the scope, the target was a geometry lesson that had turned confessional. High freeboard, square-cut shadows along the edge where aircraft would someday sit and never would. Enright did not think about names. He thought about bearing rate, target speed, lead angle, and the ocean's habit of punishing men who hurry. "Shoot!" he said, and 6 steamfish surged, spaced not for luck, but for coverage. Their wakes would have shone milky in daylight. At this hour they were threads the sea pretended not to notice. Aboard Shinano, the first hit announced itself not as sound, but as a change in the way steel carried weight. Then sound arrived, heavy and near, like a door slammed in a narrow hall. A second thud wrote its twin into the ship's bones. Lights flickered. The deck angled a degree unfriendly to coffee cups. Abe's orders were crisp. Speed up, isolate, counterflood. Speed, faithful friend of the confident, pushed more water through seams whose pride had not been tempered by time. Petty officers counted heads and hoses, with the brows of men adding when subtraction would have been kinder. Red watched the amperage settle after the last tube's recoil and let his palm rest on the panel the way a father pats a child who has done the family proud. Enright did not look back. He ordered a turn to clear datum and listened to his men count the intervals to impact like a liturgy. "That's 3, someone said softly, not meaning to mark it as victory so much as record. The ocean closed its mouth over evidence. An impossible arithmetic revealed itself in the quiet between detonations. 6 torpedoes, a few £1,000 of explosive each, striking a ship of roughly 60,000 tons and removing her from war in minutes. 1 submarine, 30-plus men on watch, erasing more steel in a morning than many nations could build in a year under blockade. It would sound like boasting if it had not been procedure. Abe gripped the rail until his knuckles went pale, and the ship answered with a list that ignored his authority. The junior officer he had sent to inspect closures stumbled back into the bridge with a face that had learned too much in one corridor. "We will hold it," Abe said, "because captains say the thing duty requires even when the sea has begun to disagree." The first minutes after the hits were not chaos so much as a tightening of margins. On Shinano's damage control boards, compartments became numbers with moods. Frame 180 showed a slow weep that turned speak, then shout. A petty officer banged the dog handles home and felt the wheel come back soft, the gasket taking a set it had never taken underway. Pumps started like arguments, loud, certain, then less certain as suction slipped. Counter-flooding orders went out along the voice pipes with a schoolteacher's patience. Water obeyed physics, not rank. The list that had been a sailor's joke, 4 degrees gives the coffee some pep, reached 7, then 9. That is the moment when men begin to widen their stance without thinking, a choreography learned without instruction. Abe held the con as if firmness could travel down steel. He didn't shout. He added time to his words, making each an anchor. Isolate. Recheck closures. Report the junior DC officer ran, counting dogged doors with a finger that touched metal as if it were a brow to be felt for fever. At a seam still bright with paint, a drip found friends. The hose team there had drilled on concrete and learned the weight of water as a concept. Now they learned it as a hand on the chest. The ship's speed, ordered in reflex to outrun the unseen, pressed more sea at her wounds. It would have been wiser to slow, but wisdom in the first minutes after violence is a luxury even seasoned ships must borrow. Up top, escorts seemed close and then far, their sonar pings like distant metronomes keeping time for a band that had lost its rhythm. Reports came in clean, clipped, without embroidery. Competence was not the problem. Time was. A list to starboard nudged equipment, turned rectangles into wedges. In a passageway, a cook threw his shoulder against a locker, not for the pots, but for the way the slam would steady the men around him. The smell changed. Paint thinner, hot oil, a sourness that lives where sea meets steel in places designed to keep them strangers. A boatswain rigged shoring that would have made a carpenter nod, the timber groaning into a geometry he trusted more than speech. Above, Abe asked for a reading he already knew by the angle of the horizon in the bridge windows. The number came back formal, adding decimal to the thing everyone felt in their knees. He looked once at the chronometer and understood that this would be measured in minutes and degrees instead of miles. He did not look again. In Archerfish, the war contracted to a whisper and a watch. Enright ordered the turn that doctrine prescribes, clear datum, go deep enough to be uninteresting, and the boat accepted the command like a good horse taking the bit. No one said, re-attack. It wasn't timidity, it was craft. A submarine that lingers near her own handiwork invites company she doesn't want. Red checked cooling water like a man feeling a sleeping child's breath, then leaned his shoulder against the panel and let the hum settle his heartbeat. Someone in the manoeuvring room passed a chocolate square down the line without names. In memory, the silence would make it taste sweeter. They listened, because sound is what's left when sight is forbidden, and heard the sea speak in a changed accent, metal labouring, a big hull taking on weight it had not scheduled. A careful man could count intervals between distant knocks and draw a picture in his head of doors being tried, valves being spun, decisions being made and unmade under fluorescent light. Enright trusted the TDC's last word more than any victory story he would ever tell. He sketched a rough track of the quarry's dying and then set his pencil aside because there's reverence in not overworking a solved problem. On Shinano the hoses thrashed like live things, and men with their names sewn new on cloth trying to act old in their courage fought to keep no more than the physics would give. It would have been typical for a chief to plant his boots and make the line behave by voice alone, the way chiefs do on ships that share one spine. Pumps that had promised numbers on paper now offered moods. A cough that meant air where water should be, a stutter that meant cavitation, a whine that was simply fatigue. The list crept through teen numbers and made doorways into hill climbs. A junior officer learned how much a handle can bite a palm when urgency steals your gloves. Escorts showed dutiful blips on someone else's radar, presence without balm. Abe asked for more speed and then took it back when the deck told him not to be proud. He would have known, as captains learn in the marrow, that he was now trading compartments for minutes, minutes for the chance that genius would arrive disguised as a petty officer with a bright idea. Genius did not come. Work came. Sweat, shouted counts, men naming gauges aloud so they could anchor each other's attention. The ship's voice pipes carried courage better than air. The fragile kind, the sturdy kind, both. In Archerfish, the coffee went around, and the bow rose a whisper as ballast traded a shade of density for prudence. The captain's eyes were calm, not from hardness, but from having seen math keep faith. "We'll send the message," he said, as if discussing weather. The men felt the boat's quiet approval, an absence of vibration that means every bearing has decided to run true. Outside, the Pacific made a clean surface above a secret already closing. The end arrived not as a single dramatic insult, but as accumulation. Degrees of list becoming a posture, compartments deciding they were contiguous after all, timbers yielding with noises that are not words but carry meaning just the same. On Shinano, the deck's tilt turned walk into lean into climb. The crew obeyed orders with the stubborn tenderness sailors reserve for their homes, because that's what a ship is until the sea convinces her otherwise. Abe stood his watch to the last, the style of a man who believes that tone can steady steel. It cannot, but tone can steady men, and that matters until it doesn't. Somewhere below, a hose got away and whipped the air with an anger that would have broken a less seasoned man's resolve. The chief, who had been its shepherd, planted a foot, took the lash, and brought it to heel by cursing in a dialect learned when ships took longer to die. He knew, even as he won that small fight, that the larger one had moved beyond his reach. A junior signalled the bridge with eyes that asked permission to hope. Abe's answer was a nod that said duty, and duty is a kind of hope. The roll steepened. Lockers unlatched and became missiles. Men learned the map of handholds in a minute that would typically require a cruise. Somewhere, an engineer slammed a valve because the slam would write his name in the record book under "did all that could be done." Abandon ship comes to officers like a confession. Necessary, late by definition, the last order that admits you have nothing left to trade but human lives. It would have been given in plain, beautiful Japanese, the kind the sea respects. From a sensible depth, Archerfish listened to a deep structural sound and understood its grammar. Enright did not grin. He let his face be an instrument panel, steady, bright with data, free of performance. Someone, possibly Red, broke a chocolate bar and left a square on a console like a small altar. The log took numbers without adjectives, time of firing, estimated hits, bearing, speed, because victory declared in nouns and verbs outlives adjectives. When the giant went, she went with the dignity of mass. The horizon buckled, air tore itself into a noise men would recall in dreams, and then the sea did what seas do, recovered its plain face, and pretended erosion had accomplished the deed. An escort circled an absence with the fervour of a friend at a fresh grave. Word ashore would be thinned by censors until it looked like rumour dressed in mourning. Reality moved in the opposite direction. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine had died on her first voyage, to one US boat that did it by the book. The ocean closed, and with it an epoch. In a stateside office that smelled of pencil shavings and hot wiring, a lieutenant analyst slid columns across a steel grey desk and made a war visible in integers. One submarine, 6 torpedoes fired, 4 solid hits, roughly 60,000 tons removed from the enemy order of battle before lunchtime. Those were local facts. The strategic facts dwarfed them and made them inevitable. In 1944, the United States produced on the order of 96,000 aircraft. Japan, nearer 28,000. Carrier groups multiplied like proofs in a textbook, while a new Balao-class boat tied up to a pier as another backed away, training pipelines stitching the Pacific with repetition and replacement. An Essex-class carrier was not merely a ship, it was a schedule. Welding shops ran 3 shifts not because of slogans, but because parts arrived on time, in numbers that let a foreman throw away a flawed casting without weeping. The impossible had settled into routine, a factory line in Michigan famously turning out bombers at a cadence that, at peak, hinted at 1 per hour, a rate that read like braggadocio until pilots flew them. This wasn't luck. It was choice rendered in rivets and coffee breaks, in the union of insistence and know-how that takes a citizen and makes him a specialist who can be replaced without diminishing the whole. The analyst penciled circles around another kind of statistic. Training hours, standardized across thousands of men, so that Enright's do-it-by-the-book meant the same thing in every control room, whether the skipper hailed from Boston or Bakersfield. The book itself had grown fat on failure, analysed without shame. Torpedoes that once embarrassed became weapons whose performance could be trusted, because engineers were allowed to fix errors faster than pride could hide them. Abundance, properly husbanded, makes honesty affordable. Back in Tokyo, Aya stood in a queue that moved like a sermon, and if you could lay her ration card beside the lieutenant's charts, you would see the war's grammar at a glance. Calories lost become sorties unflew, training unlearned, sleep too thin to permit finesse. Industrial democracy's peculiar grace, generosity turned to throughput, made Archerfish's professionalism predictable. Predictable does not mean easy. It means repeated until the extraordinary wears the clothes of Tuesday morning. On another desk sat a different paper, plans for an operation that would send Yamato to sea as a symbol turned projectile. The analyst underlined a line about air group sortie capacity and wondered if the battleship men reading it felt the century shifting under their feet. Numbers are not neutral. They lean their weight on doctrine until doctrine admits the obvious. The report closed with a sentence that could have been carved on the war's headstone. Mass applied intelligently shortens wars and saves lives. Early 1945. In a windowless room, the censor's brushes made neat thunder. They did not erase. They softened. Headlines became euphemisms. A captain's name returned to his family's table only in the hush after dinner. Aya learned to read absence as fluently as text, to hear the shape of a ship in the way a newspaper skipped a line it should have loved. In staff offices where maps took entire walls, planners wrote around a hole where Shinano ought to have been, a deck that would not carry fighters, a repair space that would not travel to a fleet dying for maintenance. Fuel had become arithmetic with teeth. Sorties were rationed not just by courage but by octane. Pilots counted not only in valour but in hours flown. You could see it in the sky over Kyushu. Fewer contrails, shorter patrols, combat air patrols that rose to meet threats and then dropped away because gasoline is a tyrant when you lack it. On the American side, Task Force 58 turned anchors into punctuation, commas between strikes that kept the sentence going until the period fell where admirals chose. The contrast did not make the foe small, it made the system decisive. In one memo, a staff officer wrote 10 go without flinching and outlined a sortie that would throw Yamato like a spear at Okinawa's throat. He did not believe in miracles, he believed in duty and optics. The plan would have read clean in the language of 1905. In 1945, it had the perfume of last rites. Intelligence officers, fed by the machinery that turned intercepts into calendars, penciled estimates, US carriers in range to launch hundreds of aircraft, a blocking force of fast battleships and cruisers ready to write history in 16-inch Gothic if the air writers failed. They would not fail. Abe's name did not appear in those papers. His war had already been folded into a lesson. Enright's did, briefly, in a report that yielded its adjectives to verbs: cited, tracked, fired, evaded, reported. That plainness is how democracies honour their killers, make them craftsmen, not myths. Aya, scrubbing a pot that never seemed to come clean, looked at a box on a shelf that had once held sugar and now held nothing, and decided that scarcity was a teacher with a strap. In the harbour mouths, ships moved like punctuation marks at the ends of edicts. The censors put away their brushes for the day, certain they had crocheted the truth into something kinder. The ocean didn't care. It read only tonnage and fuel and men, and it had already begun to compose the sentences of April. 7 April 1945 and after. Morning over the East China Sea wore a low, workmanlike grey. Yamato, Yahagi and their destroyers drove a white seam through it toward Okinawa, the wind hammering flag and face alike. Briefly, fighters from Kyushu dotted the sky, too few, too soon exhausted. Radar on US decks gave the day its tempo. When Task Force 58 loosed its first wave, the horizon filled with purposeful specks that resolved into Avenger torpedo bombers and Helldiver dive bombers, Wildcats and Hellcats riding shotgun in a geometry learned at 1,000 briefings. The strike count would vary by source, but hundreds of American aircraft rose and almost all came home. From Yamato's decks, the sky must have looked like arithmetic turned personal. Type 96 and Type 89 guns slashed at it, tracers stitching furrows into clouds. Sanshikidan beehive shells burst in angry cones. It was brave gunnery, lavish ammunition, and largely symbolic. Torpedoes found her flank. Sources tally at least 7, some say more, and bombs cratered the armoured decks with concussions that tore at systems and men alike. The ship that had been baptised in secrecy took daylight like a confession. By early afternoon, steering would have jammed, orders to abandon would have gone down ladders with the same dignity they had once gone up. At approximately 14:23 local time, she rolled, and a magazine detonation wrote a cloud into the day that witnesses could see from 100 miles. Impossible numbers sat inside the smoke. Roughly 390 American aircraft sent to kill one ship, while 6 fast battleships waited in reserve and never fired a shot. Japanese fighter cover, numbering in the teens that morning, burned away like breath on glass. US losses, on the order of 10 aircraft, hurt specific families without touching the system. Japanese losses made a ledger page we still read with a steady voice. Thousands aboard Yamato did not come home. Names deserve silence here, not statistics, but the scale matters because it tells a truth about doctrine-meeting industry. The parable tightened. Shinano had died to one submarine working by the book at night. Yamato died under a sky authored by logistics in daylight. In both cases, American industrial democracy turned courage into procedure, spare parts, octane, replacement air crews, standardized manuals, practiced handoffs between intelligence and operations, none of it dramatic to the eye, all of it the machinery that makes victory reliable. Aya, older by a hard winter, watched a column of smoke on the newsprint of rumour and understood that hunger had become strategy's handwriting. After the war, Enright would answer questions with the same verbal restraint that had steered his boat. He had done what he was trained to do. Abe's sailors would be remembered by those who loved them and by those who study why bravery, without resources, becomes tragedy. The world we inherited learned a lesson that still feels like prophecy. In a contest between myth and manufacturing, manufacturing wins when